All fans of military history have ever wondered who were the best generals of World War II. The men who had the greatest responsibility in the most important operations. The men who designed the most daring operations. And ultimately, the men to whom the Führer handed over the destiny of Germany. It is not easy to make a decision, because there are many factors that come into play. However, it is relatively easy to identify the three marshals who assumed the greatest responsibility throughout the entire conflict, and nominate them for this title. Next, in this program, we are going to carefully analyze the three men who stood out the most within the German army, and in the end, we will choose the best of all in the most objective way possible. The first general on our list, which we name first solely because he is the oldest of the three, is General von Rundstedt, who in 1940 rose to the rank of marshal. There is no doubt that Rundstedt had one of the longest careers compared to any other general of the Wehrmacht, and the first thing that catches our attention in his history is that he retired just a year before the war began. Born in 1875, Rundstedt participated in the First World War when he was over 40 years old, holding the rank of commander. In 1938, at the age of 63 and with the rank of Colonel General, who would later be nicknamed the Last Prussian, he decided to retire and retired from active service within the Wehrmacht. However, due to his extensive experience, he was called back in May 1939 to help in the preparations for the German campaign in Poland that would be launched 4 months later. From this point on, Rundstedt was one of the key players in all the major German operations during its first triumphant years. In Poland he took charge of Army Group South. In France, he led Army Group A, which carried out the most important task of the attack by crossing the Ardennes and reaching Dunkirk, dismantling the entire Franco-British defensive system. Later, during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Rundstedt once again led Army Group South, achieving victories that until now were believed to be impossible, such as the Siege of Kiev in September of that same year. Rundstedt's good streak ended practically at the same time as that of most German generals, at the end of November in the city of Rostov. After the wear and tear that the German army had suffered during its 5 months of advance through the Soviet Union, the arrival of winter, and the recovery of the Red Army, the Germans were forced to retreat when their enemy went on a counterattack. The case of Rundstedt, with his Army Group South, was especially striking because he was the first to receive the Soviet onslaught that occurred at the end of 1941. Thus, when his men were forced to abandon Rostov, Rundstedt was considered an incompetent marshal, and Hitler himself went to the southern Eastern Front on December 3 to dismiss him. Just 2 days later, the Soviets also counterattacked in the vicinity of Moscow, and it was seen that the bad situation that Army Group South was going through was not because of Rundstedt, since the entire German front in Russia was exactly the same or worse. This was the last time the veteran marshal held a position on the Eastern Front, going on in March 1942 to take charge of the German armies established on the Western Front, along the Atlantic coast. After more than 2 years taking charge of defensive preparations in France, a position he shared with Rommel during the months leading up to the Allied invasion, Rundstedt was primarily responsible for the defense of the Western Front until he was finally dismissed in March 1945. However, between both periods he also suffered another dismissal that led him to be removed from combat during the month of July and August 1944, returning again to take charge of the situation on the Western Front, together with Marshal Walter Model in September. As we have seen after analyzing Rundstedt's service record, there is no doubt that he was the German marshal who led large army groups for the longest time, of which, whether during the good years of advance, or during the bad final years, the fate of Germany depended. But does this make him the best general Germany ever had? Well, this will be something we finish analyzing when we have seen the other two candidates. Born in 1887, our next general in chronological order is Erich von Manstein. Manstein, unlike Rundstedt, was not notable for starting World War II commanding large army groups. But he did stand out for being behind the planning of the daring offensives that led the Wehrmacht to reap its first victories. Both the remilitarization of the Rhineland, The annexation of Austria, the Polish campaign, or the offensive against France through the Ardennes, had Manstein's active participation. Due to their great ability to propose strategies that made their colleagues look bad, both Halder and Brauchitsch wanted to get Manstein out of the way so that he would not compete with them. In this way, after the German victory in France in June 1940, Halder wanted to send Manstein to Africa, so that he could not be present in the future campaign that was coming against the Soviet Union. However, this maneuver did not go well because Hitler intervened, and Erwin Rommel was finally the general assigned to North Africa. Manstein's next military action was found precisely during Operation Barbarossa, in which he led a Panzer Corps integrated within Army Group North. However, on this occasion, he was not allowed to participate in the preparations for said operation against the Soviet Union, and was only informed a month before the attack began, like the other Army Corps commanders. There he stood out, leading one of the units that made its way through the Baltic countries the fastest towards Leningrad, traveling 315 kilometers in just 4 days. Later in September, when the operation was at its peak, Manstein was transferred to the Crimea to assume command of the German 11th Army. From here on, his career was unstoppable. The conquest of Sevastopol in July 1942 caused Manstein to be promoted to Marshal, and shortly after, he was sent to Leningrad because he was considered an expert in the sieges of large cities. However, before he could do anything, Manstein had to be transferred again to the southern Eastern Front, to face the greatest crisis experienced by the German army to date. On this occasion, he had to take charge of re-establishing the front line, and rescuing the troops surrounded in Stalingrad. After a failed rescue operation, Manstein focused solely on re-establishing the front, devising ways to inflict a heavy defeat on the Soviets while he did so. This counterattack, which led to the Third Battle of Kharkov, was another of his greatest successes of the entire war. His next action was the direction of the southern pincer of what was known as Operation Citadel, which was the one that made the most progress, and the one that inflicted the most casualties on the Red Army. However, his efforts were in vain, and from August 1943, Soviet pressure from the Ural salient to the Donetsk basin forced the Germans to retreat to the Dnieper. During the final months of 1943, and the first 3 months of 1944, Marshal Manstein's Army Group South was fighting a multitude of defensive battles along the entire bank of the Dnieper, retreating progressively. Under his command, his armies never reached a point of total collapse, as would begin to occur in the summer of 1944. Finally, he was dismissed by Hitler on March 30th of that same year, never occupying any new military position. And finally, our third nominee is none other than Marshal Walter Model, born in 1891. Of all the men we are analyzing in this program, Walter Model was the last to stand out and become famous within the Wehrmacht, although once he proved his worth, he became the main protagonist. Model began to stand out during Operation Barbarossa, at the hands of the 3rd Panzer Division, although it was not until his stubborn defense against Moscow that Hitler learned of his existence. From there, and after his defense of the Rzhev salient during the end of 1942, Walter Model established himself as one of the best defensive generals of the German army, and Hitler began to value him above the others. During the Battle of Kursk, he led the northern pincer of the attack, although his main task ended up being to defend the Ural salient. However, it was during this withdrawal action towards the Dnieper, in which not even Walter Model could effectively contain the Red Army, that he ended up being relieved of his command of the 9th Army in September 1943. After a few months of rest, Walter Model was called back into service in January 1944, and it was here that he became Hitler's official firefighter, always being sent to the most critical places on both the Eastern and Western fronts. In January, he was sent to resolve the critical situation of Army Group North, which had just been severely beaten by the Red Army after liberating the city of Leningrad. At the end of March, Model was sent to take charge of Army Group South following the dismissal of Manstein, which coincided with the arrival of the Soviets on Romania's northern border. In June, Walter Model was sent to Army Group Center to try to contain Operation Bagration, which had already torn apart the German armies in the vicinity of Minsk. In these three destinations, and even if he had to retreat, Model was able to leave a fairly stable situation before leaving. His final departure from the Eastern Front came in August 1944, when after having contained the Soviet advance on Warsaw, he was sent to the Western Front to try to save the situation in France after the Allied breakup in Normandy. From here, Model took care of re-establishing the entire German defensive line on the Siegfried Line, and rejected Montgomery's operation nicknamed Market Garden. Finally, he led the Ardennes offensive, and subsequently held the Allies on the Rhine until the end of March 1945. Well, once the presentations of each candidate have been made, let's move on to evaluate, in the most objective way possible, which was the most competent marshal that Germany had during the Second World War. The third position goes to Marshal Rundstedt, who, although he was a very good organizer, cannot be compared with the skills and initiative that Manstein or Model had. Regarding our last two nominees, it is clear that both marshals knew how to perfectly organize the units under their command, and were masters in both defense and attack. Both Manstein and Model were always sent where the situation was most critical, and they knew how to re-establish the line and manage to counterattack. However, we can find a difference in the way he leads his men. While Manstein was more sophisticated and more of a map and strategy man, Model was a frontline general who liked to be present among his soldiers. While Manstein always stood out for his elaborate plans and his ingenuity, Model stood out for his determination and his total ability to improvise on the field. On the other hand, we have to find the main difference between them not in his way of being or in his way of directing, but rather we have to establish it by the period in which each one held his most important commands. While Manstein did it during the year 1942, until mid-1944, Model would have it mainly from 1944 after Manstein's replacement. Thus, while Manstein had to face a very difficult situation for the German army, Model, starting in mid-1944, had to face a situation that was already practically impossible for the Third Reich. The fact of achieving only defensive achievements is perhaps what can most diminish Model's fame, since he does not have great victories and strategic plans like Manstein. In any case, and putting both offensive and defensive successes at the same level, I sincerely believe that both men were practically at a similar level, and always knew how to get out of the most difficult situations, getting the most out of their units. However, what tips the balance between them, and will be key to winning first position, is the opinion that the rest of their teammates, and even the German leader, had about them. There are opinions from both Guderian, Rommel, Kluge, and Keitel among others, who at the time made it clear that Manstein was the best of all of them, and was the only person to whom they would have entrusted the supreme command of the German army from 1943. Furthermore, Hitler himself acknowledged to Guderian on numerous occasions that Manstein was the best strategist Germany had. After this analysis, there is no doubt that Manstein has to occupy the first position, since he stood out both in the direction of divisions, as well as army corps, and large army groups, not to mention the brilliant operations he designed throughout his career. Finally, he achieved something that is even more complicated, as he earned the respect and admiration of the majority of his companions like no other general. Well, that's it for this program, which if I'm honest, I've been wanting to do since I opened the channel. Do you agree with this top 3? If you want to analyze exactly what other generals and the German leader himself thought about Manstein, I leave you the program on the 6 curiosities about Manstein that we recently uploaded in the description.